Hello, good evening. My name is Thomas Parrish. This evening, it is my distinct privilege to introduce 12th-generation Nantucketer, Dr. Frances Karttunen. She graduated from Radcliffe College and would go on to get her Ph.D. from Indiana University. But one of Dr. Karttunen's grandparents was a native Nantucketer. The other was an immigrant from Finland, and the difficulties that they encountered were among the inspirations for her books Between Worlds and The Other Islanders, The People Who Pulled Nantucket's Oars. She's also the author of numerous other publications and books about Nantucket history, and in 2011, she was honored as an NHA Research Fellow. But tonight, she's here to talk about one of her newest publications, The Adventures of Nancy Gardner Prince. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed speaker tonight, Dr. Frances Karttunen.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to see you here. The story of Nancy Gardner Prince took so long to become a reality as this new book. But Nantucketers have a fascination with the daughters of Nantucket. I think if you look at publications or go to talks, you hear about the petticoat row ladies and so forth. And Nancy, I discovered, was another daughter of Nantucket that I knew nothing about, and neither did anybody else. So my talk tonight is another daughter of Nantucket. Here we go. So just thinking about the people we do know about, who are some of the people, the women that we recognize as daughters of Nantucket? For sure, this lady, you recognize her, I think. That's Maria Mitchell. We know she is definitely a daughter of Nantucket. She was born here. Her birthplace house is on Vestal Street, right next to the Maria Mitchell Observatory. And those of us who know more about her know that when she discovered the comet that made her famous and led eventually to her becoming a professor of astronomy at Vassar College, she discovered that comet from a makeshift observatory on top of the Pacific Bank. Also, we may remember that she was the first librarian of the Nantucket Atheneum. So Maria certainly, but who's another daughter of Nantucket? Lucretia Mott, yes. There was Lucretia. And we know she's famous. She did something significant. But if you'd asked me when I was in school in Nantucket, I wouldn't have been able to say why. She's famous, but, well, we know that she was born on Fair Street in the building where the Ship's Inn is now, but in a much more modest home at the time. And we might wonder why she also gets a lane named for her. The reason that Nantucketers don't know much about Lucretia is that her family left Nantucket when she was 11, and she was sent to an off-island boarding school where she married young and lived out her life in Philadelphia. And here's a picture of her and her husband, James. They were both teachers, actually, at the school when they met. And in later years, Lucretia often came back to visit Nantucket, but she did her work for peace and justice, abolition of slavery, and women's rights. She did all of that in faraway places. And then Barbara White has given us a book about Anna Gardner, and again, a daughter of Nantucket for sure. Anna was born on Nantucket. And she, still as a very young woman, she was a teacher in Nantucket's segregated African school, that met in the African Meeting House on the corner of York and Pleasant Street. But then she did something more, and she did that off-island. She established a series of freedmen schools in the South right after the Civil War. So she left Nantucket, she went to South Carolina and to Virginia and established schools. But then there's another woman who's been promoted as a daughter of Nantucket, and that's Mary Ellen Pleasant. But Mary Ellen Pleasant is known as the mother of civil rights in California, but she wasn't born here, and she was only here for a very few years. Actually, I'm very pleased with the story, and I'm not sure that it's really true, but it's a good story, that she began writing her life story, and it began, some people say I was born in slavery, but actually I was born in Philadelphia. So somebody brought up Lucretia. Can anybody think of any other daughters of Nantucket that we might know of?
Josephine Brooks.
Okay. And anybody else? The NHA has been pretty good about publishing in historic Nantucket quite a lot of career histories of Nantucket businesswomen. The one I remember in particular, because I overlap, she was an elderly woman when I was a child, was a businesswoman on Petticoat Row named Cora Stevens. But we claim a lot of entrepreneurial women, wives of whaling captains who went to sea, for instance. Clergy women, a couple of them, an early professional physician. Our women have done well by us. So now we'll move on to Nancy. And the story begins, for me, on Strait Wharf. Lauren Brock, who some of you surely remember, was proprietor of the toy boat shop on Strait Wharf, right across the street from where the High Line gets in. And Lauren said to me that sometimes customers would walk off the High Line and straight into her shop and ask her for children's books about African Americans on Nantucket. And she said, well, for high school students, she could recommend my book, The Other Islanders, which has a lot about African Americans on Nantucket. But for younger readers, she had nothing at all. And there was nothing at all. And there was nothing more for quite a long time. But at that time, I was president of the Friends of the Nantucket Atheneum, and Betty Spriggs was a member of the Board of Trustees of the Atheneum. And one day, Betty brought this tired-looking little old book to me, which is right there, that little book. And she said, this is in the Atheneum vault, and we'd like to know what it's got to do with Nantucket. And I opened it, and I had no idea. So it was an old book, so I put on my little white gloves so I wouldn't harm it, and I began turning the pages. And it was an 1850 first edition of the autobiography of some married woman named Mrs. Prince. It meant nothing to me at all. But on the first page, Nancy tells us that she's the daughter of Thomas Gardner of Nantucket. And my eyes just flew open because I knew a lot about African Nantucketer Thomas Gardner. He's very well documented. So in 1788, along with two other African Nantucketers, Thomas Gardner became a member of Nantucket's first congregational church, the church that we call the North Church, that one over there. So three African Nantucketers join a congregational church. One of the others was a woman simply called Hagar. And Hagar had been enslaved by 2 generations of the White, Coffin, and Gardner families. So Hagar tells us a lot about enslavement in Nantucket in the 1700s. James Gardner, who was born in 1640, so he was born before Nantucket was settled. His parents were Tristram and Dionis Coffin, and they brought James to Nantucket. Well, in 1720, he was 80 years old, and he died, and in his will, he left Hagar to his 55-year-old daughter, Mary Coffin Gardner, with a proviso that upon Mary's death, apparently anticipated she didn't have much lifetime left to go, that Hagar would then be passed on to his son, John Coffin. Well, Mary did live a long time. She lived another 21 years with Hagar serving her. And when she died, it's possible that Hagar then was passed on to John Coffin for another 7 years. But he died in 1747. Slavery continued on Nantucket and finally ended around 1775. And then it was declared unconstitutional in Massachusetts in 1783. Hagar was still living. In 1785, the selectmen declared Hagar as one of the town poor, which meant that the town was going to help support her in her apparently deep old age. And a couple of years later, she and Thomas Gardner and a woman named Amy Gardner were all admitted into membership in the Congregational Church. Considering that she was still alive in 1788, she must have been an enslaved child when James Coffin passed her on. Well, the 2 other people with Hagar who joined the church were Thomas Gardner and a woman named Amy Gardner, and I strongly believe that they were her children who had taken the name Gardner because of the many years that their mother had served the Gardner family. So Thomas Gardner obviously was not enslaved. There was a census taken in 1790 of Massachusetts free black families, and Thomas Gardner is listed in that census as head of a household of 2. I don't know whether it was he and Amy or whether by this time he had married, but he was head of household. The next year, he had apparently saved so much money from going whaling that he purchased shares in the commons, in the common and undivided land, and then he turned them into the proprietors for a set-off of land for his homestead. And having done that, in 1796, he paid property taxes to the town of Nantucket. I mean, this is really good documentation of a guy. And then he disappears. No more records, no death record, no more census, nothing. He's gone. But in her book, Nancy takes it up from there. She said that in 1799, the year she was born, Thomas Gardner died of tuberculosis, and she was born and raised on the mainland. So what happened then? Despite a very difficult, hard childhood, Nancy apparently did get some schooling, and she learned to read and write. And then in 1850, she wrote her life story, never forgetting her Nantucket roots. When she was asked who she belonged to when she was in antebellum New Orleans, she said, "I don't belong to anyone. I am the daughter of Thomas Gardner of Nantucket." She spent, like her father, a remarkable amount of time in her adult life at sea. Now, if you were going to write a story about a free black woman in Massachusetts in the first half of the 1800s, you probably would not make her seagoing. But she was. She sailed from Boston to Russia, to Jamaica, and not of her own will, but because of a hurricane, to New Orleans during the time of slavery in New Orleans. She also spent a good deal of time in Philadelphia. She had a working relationship with none other than Lucretia Mott. And there was this hurricane at sea that they were headed for New York and ended up instead in the Caribbean and were towed into New Orleans. Also, on one of her sea voyages, she actually encountered genuine pirates of the Caribbean. And as I was reading her story, when I got to the Pirates of the Caribbean, then and there, I knew we had a story for middle school students. She knew all the prominent black and white abolitionists in Boston. And when she published her book in 1850, it was a hit. It sold well. And the Atheneum acquired a first edition, and they'd kept it. They'd been keeping it in the vault for 150 years when Betty Spriggs brought it out and asked me, "What's this got to do with Nantucket?" But just think, they had it all that time. They got it and they took care of it. And so as I read Nancy's life story, this is the book Lauren Brock wanted. This is a book for middle school students. It's an adventure story, and it's true, and it's written in Nancy's own words, and no writer of fiction could ever possibly have made it up. And it took me a really long time from that concept until it was published. And during that time, I realized that for middle school readers and even young adult readers, that the format should be a graphic narrative. Now, I don't say a graphic novel, although I'm sure that's what people are going to call it, but a novel implies fiction. And this is not fiction. This is a narrative. So I was actually inspired by two graphic books. One of them is Persepolis, which is a memoir of the Iranian Revolution that was published in 2007. And another one was John Lewis's March, which is actually a trilogy about the civil rights movement. So the first volume was published in 2013, and it was a small publisher who published it, but a large trade publisher saw the potential, bought the rights, put out volumes 2 and 3, and volume 3 won the National Book Award in 2016. So these were my touchstones for what we could and should do with Nancy's book. Fortunately, I was put in touch with an artist named John Walsh, and he's Irish, actually, and his previous graphic narrative or novel was about the Irish potato famine. And he was living in Boston at the time, and I was here, so I took the boat over to Hyannis, and he drove down, and I told him the concept, and I didn't have to sell him on it. He understood it right away and began to talk about how could we do this. So one of the things was we wanted to have it historically accurate. If it was going to be something that might be used in education, it should be right. So we consulted old paintings, and we thought, how does Nancy dress? So we consulted Julie Stackpole, who many of you know, I think, who's an expert on period costuming. And she has a book called Dressing the New Republic, which ends just barely overlapping Nancy's time. But she sent us a lot of images and references to what people were wearing between 1800 and 1850, and also suggested that John and I watch a 3-part PBS series called The Long Song, which is about Jamaica in the days just before the end of slavery there. So as a newlywed, Nancy went with her husband to Russia and encountered a very strange new land, as you can well imagine. One of the things is that during the winter, she reported that the Russian outdoor markets offered naturally frozen fresh meat and fish. She had a tremendous interest in markets everywhere she went. She was also present in St. Petersburg for a deadly flood that nearly took her own life. So her husband was a man named Nero Prince. He was from Marlborough originally. He was one of the prominent black men of Boston, but he had gone to St. Petersburg with a captain, and one of the Tsar's doormen, they were called the Abyssinian Guards, had just passed away and needed to be replaced. Now the guards they had to be tall, impressive black men, and they also had to be Christian. And they had very magnificent uniforms, and the Abyssinian Guard and their uniforms lasted right up until the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917, so we have photos. We know what they look like and what the uniforms were like. And because of Nero Prince's position in the Tsarist court, Nancy attended all sorts of dinners and balls, and she writes about all of this in her autobiography. There was a lot of dancing and dining and entertainment that went on. She refused to dance or to gamble because she said that was against her religion. And she made the point that Russian members of the Orthodox Church were strict about observing the customs of their religion, and she expected them to accord her the same respect, which they did. So here she is saying no to an invitation to dance and relying upon her Bible to give her the strength to not dance or play dice. As I said, she had an interest in markets. Later on, as an older woman traveling alone, she went to Jamaica and described the markets, outdoor markets in Jamaica. I mean, right down to counting how many stalls and what stalls sold what things. So 2 places in Jamaica that she spent some time. One is St. Anne Parish, and we have a painting of St. Anne Parish from 1825, just a short time before she went there. And the other place was Montego Bay, which I think we know a lot of people on Nantucket from Montego Bay. And we have a painting of Montego Bay from 1820. But Nancy's life ended in 1859, just when photography was in its infancy. So without photos or even a painted portrait, we just had to try to figure out what Nancy looked like from infancy through adolescence and young adulthood and to late middle age. And John's vision of Nancy sort of evolved. So here's a cover that John originally thought of, and we didn't go with this eventually. But there she is, a young, rather assertive-looking Nancy with her hands on her hips, and then these three bands. And the top band references slavery that she observed in New Orleans. The middle band is her experience in Russia, and the bottom one is her many, many sea voyages. One of the things that we decided this wasn't a good cover is that somebody looking at it without looking into the book would think that it was a slave narrative, that she's the one who's in chains, and we didn't want anybody to form that opinion. Here are some studies that John made originally about how Nancy might look from her mid-20s to her mid-30s. And then something wonderful happened as he was thinking about how she dressed and how she did her hair and whether she wore a cap or not. This pair of paintings was exhibited in a show at the Folk Art Museum in New York City. And this is a pair of portraits of rather prosperous black Bostonian couple of exactly Nancy's time. So these were on exhibition in New York. And the name of the exhibition was Unnamed Figures, but as a matter of fact, we know the names of the people in these portraits. But it was a show at the Folk Art Museum in the winter of 23-24. And given this, John modeled Nancy on the woman in the portrait, who not only lived at the same time, but her name was also Nancy. So when you look at the portrait and you look at John's representation of Nancy, you see how it's modeled on the portrait. So in this new book, Nancy ages from infancy to late middle age, and she's often in the company of other people. So the question is, how do we always know which one is Nancy, whatever her surroundings and whatever her age? And we came up with this. A scallop shell on a string around her neck. As an infant, she has a scallop shell, and all through her life, she wears her shell. So you see her as a young woman in Russia saying no thank you to an invitation to dance. You see her waving goodbye to her husband when she precedes him back to Boston, and you see her as a prominent older widow, and the shell is always there. Sometimes it's hidden under her clothes, but we can invite young readers to follow the shell all the way through the book. And the new book concludes, this is the last page, with Nancy's shell and the Atheneum, where the book came to rest. So it's a symbol of Nancy's Nantucket heritage, but it's also a symbol of the Nantucket Atheneum, which has now preserved the original book for over 175 years. So it has been on exhibition on the ground floor of the Atheneum, and I'm sure it's going to go right back there after this evening. So you don't have to request to have it brought from the vault right now. You can see it out in the open. Well, this 1850 autobiography was really popular, and so Nancy published a second edition 3 years later, which has been reprinted with a different title in a kind of scholarly edition, not something that young readers would be likely to pick up. And in her preface to the second edition, she says that friends had read the first edition and asked her to tell more about things, particularly more about her decade in Russia. And she says she's not doing this out of vanity, but to support herself, because she's aware that by this time she'd been a widow for quite a while, and she's aware that there are benevolent societies for the support of widows, but she doesn't want support from that quarter not if she can support herself in another way. And she says she's getting old, she's getting sick and weary, and she does not want to become the ward of a benevolent society. So the new edition is her effort to remain independent. And there's a third edition. 3 years before she dies, she brings out a third edition. And those books are said to be found in old Boston homes many years later. When we were working on the book, I couldn't find a death record for her, and it was just like her father's just sort of suddenly disappears. I thought Nancy's pulling the same trick, but no. We now know that she died in 1859, and her grave is in Woodlawn Cemetery in Everett, Massachusetts, and only recently a memorial stone has been placed there, and I'm still trying to find out exactly who the good person is who is behind that. So there's a second and a third edition, but this is drawn from the original first edition. And it's not a story about Nancy, it's her story told by herself. And we've been really dedicated to her own words, not paraphrasing, not changing. And this makes Nancy's life story somewhat different because she had two more or less contemporaries, Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, who are both, up to this point, a lot more famous than Nancy Prince. But Sojourner Truth was 2 years older than Nancy, lived a lot longer. Harriet Tubman was younger, and they both outlived her by many years. They had both been born into slavery and been denied the opportunity to learn to read and write. So they dictated their life stories to others who wrote them down for publication, and they were published. In the very same year that Nancy's autobiography was published, 1850, William Lloyd Garrison also published Sojourner Truth's story as told to a woman named Olive Gilbert, and he was selling both books from his office at the same time. And there were multiple following editions of Sojourner Truth's story as well in the 1800s. And as for Harriet Tubman, she had an authorized biography by a woman named Sarah Hopkins that was published in 1868 with also a couple further editions. But the role of these two women who wrote down the stories and then brought them into publication has always been subjected to questions of authenticity because they said, okay, the stories were dictated to you, you transcribed them, then you edited them, and you edited them with an eye to what the audience expects or wants. We don't really know. It's exactly the story that Sojourner Truth or Harriet Tubman would have told if they told it for themselves and it wasn't mediated. But what distinguishes Nancy Gardner Prince's autobiography is she wrote it herself. She chose what's in it. She had had a very difficult childhood, but she was literate. And we see from other published writing of hers, because this isn't the only thing she published, we see she was a fluent writer. So we can feel absolutely confident in the authenticity of her life story. And she was a very accurate recorder of events. We included at the end of the book cameos of all the people that she mentions that she met in the course of her life. And they're all people that really, these are the real people, and they really were where she said they were when she said they were there, and there's only two of all of them that, for the present, we haven't been able to identify. One was a lady named Mrs. Robinson, who was her landlady in St. Petersburg, having moved to St. Petersburg from Providence, Rhode Island. I've really worked on finding Mrs. Robinson, and I haven't yet. And the other is she says that there was an acquaintance of her grandfather who was approaching 100 years old when she returned from Russia in 1833. And there's one candidate for that, but the timing doesn't really work. There's a man named Darby Vassell who's getting to be well known. He was an African-American enslaved child during the American Revolution, and he could have known Nancy's grandfather, who was a combatant in the Battle of Bunker Hill. So as an adult, Darby Vassell lived in the same neighborhood on Bunker Hill, I don't mean Bunker Hill, as Nancy, and he moved in the same social circles of abolitionists. He lived to the age of 92, but he outlived Nancy by 2 years, and when she returned to Boston in 1833, he would have still been in his late 60s and nowhere near 100. So I'm not really sure about that. But I don't have any other candidate. So I marked up a copy of the 1990 printed version of the second edition of Nancy's book, highlighting what became a part of this new book, so you can just see to what extent. Some pages like this, we took a lot. In other cases, from the second edition, only a date. We were very careful to leave it all in Nancy's words, and in very few cases, we replaced words because we thought readers might not understand. So there's a couple of places where she is talking about somebody who's obviously a nanny, but young readers, nursery girl, what in the world is a nursery girl? And then right in the same place, she talks about her sister Sylvia being deluded away, and we substituted kidnapped. The other change we made throughout was wherever she talks about the Emperor and Empress of Russia, we changed it to Tsar and Tsarina. But that's it. That's the only changes we made. So right now, the sixth graders at Nantucket Cyrus Pierce School are studying the adventures of Nancy Prince. And they're creating their own projects based on it, and they're going to showcase their projects at the African Meeting House on Nantucket on June 16. And I think they're planning to keep those projects at the Meeting House for Juneteenth, so the public can go and see what the sixth graders have done. And I really, really hope that this book will continue to reach middle school students, both on Nantucket and the mainland. So, to conclude, with many thanks to the Nantucket Historical Association for making this book a reality and bringing Nancy's story to new readers, not just middle school students, but everybody. This is an American story, and we should really appreciate it. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I would love to open up the floor to Q&A, and please just wait until me or my colleague make our way around with the microphone. But with that, are there any questions?
It's a simple question. Is the book available, the original, to read? Sorry, is the book the original?
No, I'm pretty sure you can't check it out of the Atheneum.
Thank you to Lincoln and the Atheneum for bringing the original copy. It's greatly appreciated to have it here at the presentation. On your way out, if you have not read the book yet and want to pick up a copy, please say hi to LMA, who's right over there. You can purchase a copy on your way out. But thank you all so much for coming. Have a lovely evening, and take care.